Hello students, you know that the state in Mughal India was a theocracy. But despite that, you come across very interesting accommodations with secularism and tolerance, which is why the Mughals were able to grant India at that time what is unmistakably good governance. So let us take a closer look at the kind of relationship that thrived between the state and religion in the times of the Mughals. The Mughal state established a firm rule in the Indian subcontinent for nearly 200 years, and they built an empire with not only great political might but also a firm administrative setup that consolidated the polity and enabled it to grow from strength to strength. From the centralization of power to creating conducive conditions for economic and cultural growth, the Mughals looked at administrative matters with great seriousness and precision. So what were the characteristics of the Mughal state? First, it was essentially a military regime. Second, it was a highly centralized despotism with the emperor as the fountainhead of all authority and power. For the Muslim subjects of this regime, the Mughal emperor was the sovereign head of both the church and the state. Hence, the emperor engaged in a number of religious and social functions in relation to the Muslim subjects, while with regard to the non-Muslim subjects, the emperor discharged only policy functions and collected revenue. The king also patronized art and culture, but this orientation was not pursued as a matter of regular, systematic policy. Let us have an interesting look at the contrast between the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughals in terms of kingship. The Sultanate theory of kingship viewed the ruler as the intermediate between the messenger of God and the deputy of the Prophet, that is the Caliph on the one hand and the Umrah on the other. The Sultan's authority was conditional upon the satisfactory performance as the Amir-il-Mu'minin, that is the leader of the faithful, and defense and promotion of his faith. Abul Fazl was, however, categorical that a ruler endowed with divine light need not function as an intermediary. The Badshah, in fact, was the repository of all power, and people were bound to obey all his rules. But Akbar, we see very interestingly, and this is an interesting contrast with the Sultanate, Akbar draws a clear contrast between the Sultanate and his Mughal India. Under Sher Shah, the state had partially emerged from the shackles of religious bias as the overwhelming or at least the dominating motivation of the ruler, inasmuch as a more liberal policy was adopted towards Hindu subjects. Yet, the liberation from religious domination was not complete, for the jizya continued to be levied. It was only when the jizya was abolished by Akbar that the basis of government was altered for the first time. It implied that the emperor had equal obligations to all his subjects, irrespective of their religious affiliations and practices, and that he exercised undifferentiated sovereignty over all of them. The king is looked upon basically as an agent of God. Abul Fazl impressed on Akbar the idea of king as an agent of God who worked on his behalf. Sovereignty was a divine light which gradually overwhelmed and eclipsed the traditional concept of the king as the shadow of God. In order to realize the noble objectives of true kingship, it was necessary to combine both religious and secular authority in the same sovereign. So long as these two powers were kept separate, Fazl states, there was strife and confusion among the children of Noah, that is mankind. Under Akbar, the spiritual and the temporal powers were sought to be combined. And the king emerges as the spiritual guide of the nation. Fazl comments that whenever from lucky circumstances the time arrives that a nation learns to understand how to worship truth, the people will naturally look to their king on account of the high position he occupies and accept him to be their spiritual leader and mentor as well. About Akbar, Fazal goes on to add that now this is the case with the monarch of our time. He is referring to Akbar. He now is the spiritual guide of the nation and sees in the performance of his duty the means of pleasing God. And what is most striking about this benevolent, pragmatic king is that he does not discriminate. The positive implications of this idea of kingship are further brought out in his preface by Abul Fazl. He says, in his wisdom, the king will understand the spirit of the age and shape his conduct accordingly. He will not be fit for the royal dignity if he does regard all conditions of humanity and sects of religion with the single eye of favor. And so it is very important that he should not be mother to some and stepmother to others. So the emperor is the guardian of justice. Fazl clarifies that if the emperor discriminated on the basis of caste, religion or class, he could not be considered to be a virtuous king. The emperor is expected to have paternal love towards his subjects, a large heart, daily increasing trust in God and concentrating on prayer and devotion. If he makes wrath the tyrant pay homage to wisdom, he shall fulfill his obligations well. And he must ensure that blind rage must not get the upper hand and inconsiderateness does not overstep the limits. He is not content with not committing violence, but he must see to it that no injustice is done within his realm. But Fazl is no blind supporter of Islam. He was in favor of the participation of Hindus in the administrative and governmental functions of the Mughal state. He was a votary of a composite culture and opined that the Hindus, the Muslims, subscribed to the doctrine of monotheism. But Muslims often misunderstood them because of their ignorance of the Hindu scriptures. Unlike Barani, who in many of his views appeared as an almost fanatical protagonist of Islam, Abul Fazl never believed in the superiority of other religions so far as Islam is concerned. So we find in Abul Fazl a distinctly secular orientation. He endorsed equality and fraternity of all religions based on the doctrine of sulh-i-kul or universal peace. He was an intellectual who embraced Catholicism in outlook and was a sworn enemy of any kind of religious orthodoxy or rigidity. He argued in his characteristic pragmatic way that if traditions were sacrosanct, then Prophet Muhammad would have no reason to inaugurate new ideas and thoughts. He believed that changes in law and religion were necessitated by changing times and circumstances. Because after all, Fazl was in a quest for a consolidated and integrated Hindustan. He did not subscribe to Barani's plea for the overarching sovereignty of Islam. Sovereignty was not restricted to any particular faith, as all religions were essentially the same, and it is only their paths that differed. Fazl was convinced that in a poly-religious and diverse country like India, monarchical sovereignty was most relevant and pragmatic. Therefore, he endorsed and supported Akbar, whose rationality demanded the creation of a stable and consolidated Hindustan which could stand out in the world confident and unshaken. So Akbar was in the quest for a more inclusive order. He needed to end the monopoly of the incumbent Muslim Orthodox elite without transgressing the limits of the Islamic order. Abul Fazl provided the theoretical foundation for this mission. Why was such a policy pragmatic? When the Mughals came to India, they were both culturally and religiously segregated from the bulk of the Indian society. As Orthodox Islam sought to establish its sway, a heterodox approach to Islam arose that removed categorization of religions and religious traditions. This ultimately precipitated a rather sticky situation for the Indian masses, as both orthodox ulamic views and mystical Sufi views had reached two radically extreme positions. And ultimately we come across the road to religious toleration, because Akbar's was an enlightened soul. All through his life, He had texts on philosophy, history, religion, science, and various other topics read out to him, and he was gifted with an incredible memory, and he could recite long excerpts from what he had merely heard. He fully understood the centrifugal tendencies of the complex Indian social political order and made a serious attempt to eliminate these by separating religion from politics. Akbar's religious policy was molded and motivated by his parental and social heritage. All of Akbar's teachers and guides in his boyhood happened to be men of unorthodox religious views. His teacher Abdul Latif was a person of liberal views. Akbar learned from him the lessons of Suli Kul or peace with all. So the seeds of pragmatism were sown right from his childhood days. And there were precedents of a policy of religious toleration. The social political environment also affected his attitudes towards the common people. Of course, Sher Shah Suri was the forerunner of Akbar so far as adopting a policy of religious toleration is concerned. But it was Akbar who was the first monarch in medieval India who raised the policy of religious toleration to the level of a secular religion. The initial stirrings of his philosophy of religious tolerance towards the Hindus manifested in the form of a spiritual awakening. He had fully imbibed the belief that all religions were equal, and he genuinely believed in secularism. He not only believed in secularism, but what is more important is that he demonstrated his beliefs in practices which went well with the people. As a part of his secular policy, he married the Rajput princess from Amber in 1562 and received voluntary services of Rajput warriors. In 1562, he declared that women and children of the enemy camp must not be molested by Mughal armies on any count. Sheikh Mubarak and his two sons Faizi and Fazal greatly influenced young Akbar. Barauni mentions that later on he was so influenced by the philosophies of the Brahmanas and the Sramanas that he started believing in the philosophy of transmigration of the soul. But what is more important, and I would like to reiterate, that Akbar was not just a believer but a practitioner of secularism. His enlightened and Catholic views were corroborated by his actions. On one occasion, when he had set camp at Mathura in 1563, he was informed that in accordance with old practice of the Muslim rulers, his government has also imposed a tax on the Hindu pilgrims for taking a holy dip in the waters of the Yamuna. He found this extremely insensitive and abolished the pilgrim tax throughout his dominion. In 1564, he even abolished the jizya, which convinced the subjects across the realm that the emperor was in a real sense everyone's sovereign. There was thus a decisive build-up to Din Ilahi. He was perhaps enlightened in proclaiming Mazhar. The main objective of this declaration was to separate politics from religion and give more importance to the royal decree than the orthodox Islamic views and laws that prevailed under the aegis of the ulema. Akbar called himself Imam-i-Adil, or the chief interpreter of the Islamic law. In this way, he developed an effective control over Diwani-Qaza, or the judicial cum religious department, which was earlier dominated by the ulemas or the Muslim theologians who were always more sympathetic towards the Muslim community at the risk of distancing themselves from the Hindus and other non-believers of Islam. It seems that by calling himself Mujahid and declaration of Mazhar, Akbar made himself the temporal as well as the spiritual leader of the nation. Akbar's spiritual enlightenment is reflected in his doctrines related with Tawhid-i-Ilahi, which was later called Din-Ilahi. But there was a more pragmatic purpose behind the Din-Ilahi. There is no denying that. By founding this religion, Akbar was eager to weld all the Indians, all people residing in the subcontinent, irrespective of their caste, creed, religious beliefs and practices, into one integrated homogeneous community. So it seems that almost like Ashoka's Dhamma, the whole approach of Din-Ilahi was basically geared towards national integration and developing peace and amity in the society and consolidating the position of the emperor as the unquestioning sovereign in the eyes of the people. The Din-i-Ilahi, therefore, far from being the cult of the emperor of God, was an expression of the personal beliefs of the emperor, but this did not certainly place him in the position of God. If anything, it was a cult in the tradition of the mystical saints, the Sufis. There was no compulsion to join the cult, and it did not outlast Akbar's death. Under it, Akbar would be the absolute sovereign in all religious and temporal matters over all classes of people. Theoretically, there was nothing absurd in this. For an empire ruled by one head, Akbar himself declared, it was a bad thing to have the members divided among themselves and at variance with one another. We ought therefore to bring them all into one, but in such a fashion that they should be one and all, with the great advantage of not losing what is noble and virtuous in one religion, while gaining whatever is better in another. In that way, honor would be rendered to God, peace would be given to the people, and security would be realized for the empire. There was definitely, therefore, both political and religious motivations behind Din-i-Ilahi. But they were welded in such a way that sovereignty could be justly and effectively exercised in a country like Hindustan with its diversified populations. Thus, we find a liberal state, even though not a secular state, in Mughal India. Of course, Akbar could not go very far in this regard. Nonetheless, what is mentionable is that the unity of the church and the state in a workable way helped attain the most cherished goal of popular integration and the consolidation of the polity, where the sovereign emperor could effectively commit himself to the welfare and well-being of the people. And Fazl commented in his usual pragmatism that ultimately it is the spirit of Islam that matters, not its religious orthodoxy, not its laws and bylaws. Abul Fazl addressed the basic question, what constituted the Islamic order? He was of the opinion that while the benchmark of the former was the enforcement of the laws of Islam, yet there was no rigid consensus on Islamic law. The Quran was open to multiple interpretations, and there was no monolithic Shariat which would need to be upheld across time and space. Laws were meant to govern human behavior in such a way that man remained on the Sirat al-Mustaqim, that is the path of God that ultimately leads one to God. Whether an order was Islamic or not depended not on the enforcement of any particular law, but rather on whether the polity conformed to the essence, the spirit, the soul of Islam. And Fazl always justified the acts of Akbar. He not only embraced the Catholicity of Akbar and his concern for all the people of the empire, but also justified the specific acts of the emperor, like the abolition of jizya. He reasoned that the Hindus were equally loyal to the emperor, having committed themselves to the advancement of the entire empire. This action was motivated to strike at the root of the desire of the ulemas to always prevail over religious matters, as it used to happen during the time of the Delhi Sultanate. Commenting on the debates which took place in Akbar's Ibadat Khana, Abul Fazl observed that the greatest merit behind these was that they were able to publicly expose the religious bigotry of the ulemas. Fazl considered the emperor as a spiritual guide of the people. He identified two tendencies of man, one class inclined towards deen, that is religion, and the other towards worldly thoughts, that is dunya. It is important to discover a common ground between the two and take into consideration the all-encompassing and omnipresent nature of God. It is important to hold in restraint the bloodthirsty fanatics who only resembled human beings superficially in body, but who actually acted not like human beings do. When such fanatics pose a menace to society, the people have no option but to turn to the emperor on account of his high position and accept him as the spiritual leader as well. So, We find a liberal policy taking shape increasingly with Akbar's passing days. But then his liberalism did meet with protest from orthodox quarters. It incurred scornful reaction from orthodox minds like Barauni, who even went to the extent of alleging that because of such abuses of Islam's, many Muslims were actually leaving the country in disgust. But Akbar was the last person to be moved by such criticisms, and generally we find that such protests did not travel much beyond occasional murmurs and protests. And Abul Fazl was always a defender of Akbar. He steadfastly defended Akbar by projecting him as a benevolent emperor whose instruments of control were favor and affection. He was a righteous ruler who had ruled for decades through the blessings of the Almighty. While steering clear of religious dogmatism, Abul Fazl used religion to glorify and rationalize the ideological foundations of the Mughal state under Akbar by representing him as a recipient of divine benediction. Thus, the Mughal state could be identified as a highly centralized, bureaucratic, and of course one which had a very large and strong army that it was ultimately underlined by force. It was a unitary state par excellence, and therefore the standard by which all preceding and succeeding states were to be judged. What Akbar's state stood for was a wonderful balance between theocracy and secularism, and that is the point I made at the very outset. The emphasis laid on tolerance during Akbar's regime indicated an implicit acceptance at some level of the idea of theocracy, or the belief that all medieval or pre-modern states were necessarily grounded and governed by religion. Akbar's secular outlook was certainly not irreligious. Religion never took a back seat, but was free from traces of religious narrow-mindedness and bigotry. Akbar's views on religion, as also Abul Fazl's portrayal of Akbar and his realm, created a new benchmark of tolerance and stability. All subsequent kings, particularly Aurangzeb, were measured against the yardstick of Akbar's secularism, and unfortunately they all fell short. So what was the most important contribution of Fazl's ideas? The political thought of Fazl championed the integration of Hindus and Muslims in the empire of Akbar. He did not emphasize that the Shariat was sacrosanct, but at the same time did not compromise on the basic principles of the Islamic order. He provided an Islamic rationale for non-discrimination between Muslims and non-Muslims, and thereby helped to consolidate the foundations of a strong state where religious affiliations of the subjects were secondary to their political allegiance. This new political culture underlined the Catholicity of outlook, and this endured till almost the modern period. And Fazl's understanding of the Islamic order also deserves mention. It was derived from the transcendental theory of Wazat al-Wujud, or the unity of being, that was developed in the 12th century by the philosopher Arabi. This philosophy believed that the Khaliq or creator and the Khalaq or creation were not disparate, separate entities. Rather, divinity pervades all creation, and there is no being who is not a part of the divine being. According to Fazl, Khair-i-Mahaz, or pure good, was the essence of the divine Lord, and absolute goodness pervades his entire creation. To Fazl, a good life did not consist merely in prayer and invocation, but demanded that an individual should arise above all sectarian differences and commit himself in service to the whole of mankind. We conclude by drawing attention to some very important and pertinent points, namely that while the principle of equality was not always honored by the Mughal state, yet Abul Fazl outlined the contours of a political ideology where discrimination on the basis of a sectarian identity was clearly absent. His close association with Akbar was premised on his freedom from any kind of religious bias, which complemented Akbar's own disposition. And Akbar's gem, that is the friend, philosopher and guide that he found in Fazl, he clearly echoed secular, rational and an enlightened temperament, which comes out very clearly in his observation that he is a man who makes justice the guide of the path of enquiry and takes from every sect what is consonant to reason. And that is why religion and state in Mughal India was underlined by a pragmatism that remains rare to this day. Thank you.